Creating FTP Sites. The File Transfer Protocol, or FTP as it's more commonly referred to, is a method of providing remote access to a server in order to be able to upload as well as download files. Now IIS 7 supports FTP right out of the box, so you don't need any special software other than the Windows Server 2008 operating system. But in order to take advantage of the new IIS 7 edition of FTP, we're first of all going to have to be running Windows 2008 and not Windows Vista, and secondly, we're going to have to download it from Microsoft's website, as it wasn't something that was included with Windows 2008, and I'll say presumably because Microsoft hadn't got it ready in time for the Windows 2008 launch date. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, hang on, didn't we install FTP in the introduction video in this series? Well, yeah, we did, but we installed the old version of FTP, which is basically the same edition as you're going to get on Windows 2003 server, not the new one that we're going to use in this video, which Microsoft seemed to be referring to as FTP 7. But the reason we installed the older version in the first place was so we could show you how to remove it should you decide you want to install the new version. Since they aren't compatible with each other, you will first need to remove the FTP feature that comes with Windows 2008 if you decide to use the new one. And by the way, if you are looking for information on the default version of FTP that comes with Windows 2008, then go ahead and download the IIS 6 FTP training videos from Winstructor, as that version of FTP in Windows 2003 is the same thing that you're going to get by default in Windows 2008. Okay, so we know that the version that ships with Windows 2008 is the old version, but when we download and we install the new version, it's going to tightly integrate with IIS 7 on Windows 2008. Now the old metabase that we used in Windows 2003, that's gone, and it uses a new configuration store instead. Now the new FTP also supports new industry standards as well, including FTP over SSL, UTF-8 and IPv6, as well as some new logging features, more informative error messages and event tracing tools to help you troubleshoot problems with your FTP sites. So on our IIS server, we're going to launch the Server Management Console by clicking the Server Manager icon here next to the Start button. Then we'll choose Roles at the top left here. And then over on the right, we're going to scroll down and we're going to click on Remove Role Services. And finally, we'll scroll down to the bottom of this window. We're going to uncheck the FTP Publishing Service, and then we'll click Next, and then Remove. Okay, it's done, so we'll click Close, and we can now go and close the Server Management Console as well. Now, obviously at this point, you are going to need to have available the FTP version 7 software to install, and to get it, you'll need to hit up Google or some other search engine and do a search for IIS 7 or FTP 7, and you should arrive at a location like this where you're able to download the file that you require. And currently, I'm looking at the 32-bit edition of this file here, but the 64-bit one is also available from the same location at iis.net. Alright, now on my desktop here, I've already downloaded the new version of the FTP Publishing Service, the 64-bit edition in my case, so we're going to double click on it, and this will start up the installation wizard, so we're going to click Next. We'll need to accept the terms of the license agreement, so we'll click that box, we'll click Next. Now we'll simply accept the defaults here to install all of these components, and we'll click Next one more time, and then we'll select Install. Okay, the installation's complete, and we can take a look at the release notes if we like, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We'll just click Finish. Okay, now we'll go and click on Start. We'll select Administrative Tools, and we'll go and launch the Internet Information Services Manager, and notice that we're actually launching the version 7 one, not the old version 6 console that we would be using if we were managing the standard FTP publishing service that comes with Windows 2008. Now that we've just installed FTP version 7, we can and we will be managing it using the new IIS Management Console, which of course is this one. So on the left hand side here, we're going to select our server SO5. And in the middle, if we scroll down a little bit, you can see here that we have 9 options that all relate to FTP. All of these things here relate to the configuration of FTP on our server, But right now we actually don't even have an FTP site, so let's go and create one first. We'll right click on our server here, SO5, and we'll choose to add an FTP site. We'll need to give this site a name, so let's just give it a name. We'll call it training. And then we'll need to define the physical path to where this site is going to live on our hard drive. So we'll click on this browse button here, and I'm going to create a new folder here on the root of my C drive. So we'll click make new folder, and I'll call it training. In fact, I'll call it training FTP, just so it's easy to identify what it is for. We'll click OK, and then we'll click next. Now here we can select what interface we want to use with this FTP site, and it does default to all unassigned, and we've seen this here before, but if you do have multiple interfaces on your server and you want to use a specific one, then you can select it from the list. Now our FTP site is going to use the default FTP port of 21, and that's the standard port for FTP, so we're going to leave that as it is. And underneath this you'll note we can also specify a virtual host for this site, and that'll allow us to have multiple FTP sites using a single IP address. And remember that if you are going to create a virtual host, you will need to ensure that your DNS server knows about it as well. Now the default here is to start our FTP site automatically when we're done with the wizard, and that's fine by me. And also our FTP sites now support SSL as well. So if you want to use Secure Sockets Layer for additional security, you certainly can, but do note that it does default to requiring SSL. So for the purposes of my lab here, I'm going to choose Allow SSL, and we'll click Next. And here we can define our authentication methods for accessing our FTP site. We could use anonymous authentication, which is fine. If you're putting together a download site for your customers perhaps, and they can come here and then download any publicly available patches and so forth. We could also choose basic authentication, and we'd select this when we want our visitors to require a username and password. So for the purposes of this lab here, I'm going to choose anonymous. Under our authorization drop-down box here, we can allow all users access to this FTP site, simply just anonymous users, or we could specify specific user groups or specific users. So I'll select all users here. Now finally, once a user has been authenticated and granted access to our FTP site, what sort of access should they have? Well, in most cases you probably don't want people uploading files to your site, so in this case we'll just select read. Okay, now we'll click finish, and if we expand our server here and expand sites, here we can see our training FTP site. Alright, well we can now test our FTP site, but remember, if you are testing it from an external computer, you will need to open up port 21 in your Windows firewall, or you'll be denied access. So we can test it from here. We'll click Start, and we'll open up a command prompt, and we'll type in FTP, and we'll go with the IP address of this server, which is 10.32.0.14, and we'll hit Enter. Alright, it's connected, so we'll type in the username of anonymous and a password, which is blank. And there we can see that we're now logged in, so if we simply type in an ls, we'll be able to see any files that are inside this directory. Now obviously, since this is a new FTP site, we don't have any files inside this folder, so let's go back to our IIS console here, and over on the right hand side in our Actions pane, we'll choose Explore, and we'll just right click in here and we'll create a new, say, bitmap image, and I'll leave the default file name there, and we'll go back to our command prompt and we'll type in an ls again, and this time we can see our new bitmap image file. Alright, well, creating an FTP site was pretty easy, so let's go back to our IIS console and we'll take a further look at some of the configuration options we have with FTP sites. So we'll click Sites, and firstly over here in the Actions pane on the right we can add in a new FTP site, and we can set the FTP site default. So let's click on FTP site default, since we've seen how to add an FTP site already. And this is going to open up a new window. The first option we have here is to allow the 8-bit Unicode transformation format, or UTF-8, which is a variable length character encoding scheme for Unicode that's able to represent any character in the Unicode standard, such as Latin letters with diacritics, which are characters like the accent character, commas, apostrophes, and so forth. We can see that the default here is to have our FTP site start automatically. And of course we saw that when we built our first FTP site. Now you can change either of these two, by the way. If you click on this little downward pointing arrow, you could set this to false and turn these features off if you like. But of course, the default here is for both of these features to be set to true. Under our behavior section, we'll expand connections. And here you can see we're going to allow up to 2 minutes to lapse before terminating any idle connections and 30 seconds for data connections. So since both of these settings here are active, after 30 seconds the data channel will be terminated, and a minute and a half later, if the connection's still idle, then our session is also going to be terminated. Disable socket pooling is set to false, and this means that socket pooling is enabled, and this means that IIS will tie up port 21 for use by itself. So if you want port 21 to be used by another application, then you'll need to set this one to true. Our maximum connections is set to this number here, which I'm not even going to try and read out. And suffice to say that if you've got this many people connecting to your FTP server, then you obviously have something really cool to download, like perhaps these training videos, although I expect that that would be illegal. Now when we do hit our maximum connections threshold above, which will probably be never, I'd imagine, we can disconnect incoming connections if we like, although the default is not to do that. Server listen backlog specifies the number of outstanding sockets that are able to be queued, so that's set to 60. After 30 seconds, if a connection has not been authenticated, we're going to disconnect that connection, and under our file handling heading, we can choose to allow files to be read whilst they're being uploaded to our FTP server. We can replace files when they're being renamed, and if there's been a problem transferring a file to our FTP server, say for example a user's connection is disconnected and we only received half the file, then do we want to keep only half that file? From experience, I hate having to manually go in and remove these files when this occurs, so personally I think it's a good idea that these features are turned off by default. Now on the left hand side, if we select our training FTP site that we created a moment ago, in the actions pane here we could also edit the permissions and the bindings for our FTP site, and these bindings is where we can edit our existing settings. So if we select our existing FTP site and select edit, we could also change the IP address that this site listens on if we've got more than one network card. We can change the port and we can set up a host name for this site as well if we like. And we've been through this before, so we'll quickly cancel out of these. Now if we click on the next option here, basic settings, you'll notice that by default we are using the default application pool for this site. And there's the folder that we created for our FTP site, and you can certainly change these things if you like. Now we can also select what credentials we'll be using to access our FTP site's root folder, and this does default to application user, although you can create a new user account or you can specify an existing one if you like. Now we can also view any applications or virtual directories as well, and under our Manage FTP Site heading we could restart, start and stop our FTP site as well. Now the final option we have here is Advanced Settings, and this will show us almost the same options we saw with the FTP site defaults, with a couple of minor differences. For example, here we have an ID for our site, which we could certainly change if we like, and there's the physical path to our FTP site, and again we can change these things as well. So apart from these two things, both this option and our FTP site defaults are pretty much the same thing. Now when we do select our FTP site on the left hand side of the IIS console, in the middle of the console this shows us some additional configuration options that we have for FTP, so let's go and take a look at what these things do. Now the first one here is FTP Authentication, so if we double click that you can see we've got two choices, Anonymous and Basic Authentication, and here we can see whether they're enabled or disabled. So to change either of these, we'll simply select the one we want to change, and over here on the right in the Actions menu we can choose to either enable it or disable it as the case may be. Now you could also right click on these and you'll find those same options there as well, so you can use whichever one you prefer. Now next we can configure Authorization Rules as well, and we're going to come back to this in a moment when we take a look at FTP User Isolation. So next is current sessions, and this is currently blank since our FTP session we started earlier would have been disconnected by now. So let's quit this one and we'll go back and rerun our FTP and enter in anonymous user and enter, and you can see that we're logged in. And now if we go back to our console and hit F5 to refresh it, here you can see our anonymous session listed here. So here we can get a list of any current sessions we've got running to our FTP site, and if we right click on that, we can also boot this user as well by disconnecting their session. Now the next option we have here is FTP Directory Browsing, and this defaults to an MS-DOS style listing, but we can change that to a Unix style listing if we prefer. And we can also choose to display virtual directories as well, how many bytes we have available on this site, and 4-digit years. So for example, if we were to say choose to display the number of available bytes that this site has, and then we click apply, we'll go back to our command prompt and we'll quit out of this and we'll log back in again, and that's anonymous. This time when we log in, there we can see the available bytes of hard disk space that this site has access to, which in all honesty is probably something you don't want to display, but hey, the option's there if you want it. Alright, let's go back to our console, and the next option we have here is FTP Firewall Support, and we can use this option to configure the IP address of an external firewall server if our FTP server uses SSL, or if our firewall doesn't modify the IP addresses in the FTP packets that are exchanged by a client and a server. Now we can also configure FTP IPv4 address and domain restrictions to either allow or deny specific addresses from connecting to our FTP server. So in our actions pane here on the right, we can choose to either add an allow or a deny entry. And both of these screens are exactly the same, so I'm not going to look at both of them. The only difference, of course, is that one of them is to allow people to access our FTP site and the other is to deny them. So since our default for our FTP site is to allow access, let's click on the Add Deny entry, and we can enter in a specific IP address or a range of IP addresses. So if you have a specific IP address in mind, you can just enter it in here. So let's just enter in an address and we'll click OK. And now this IP address here won't be able to access our FTP site. Now, by the way, I did just say that the default is to allow everyone access to our FTP site, but then we just denied a single IP address from accessing it. But if you want to configure your FTP site the other way around and deny everyone, but then add in a specific IP address to allow access to, we'll click on Edit Feature Settings, and we'll change this drop-down box here from the default, which is allow, to deny. And if we apply this change, then no one's going to have access to our site unless we explicitly define an allow entry. But by the way, if you have made all these changes, let's just cancel this, and you've changed your mind about your configuration choices, you can click Revert to Parent and then put back all of the original defaults. Right, let's go back to our training site, and the next option we have here is FTP Logging, and this is all pretty logical here. We can see the default path to our log files, and down the bottom here under our log file rollover section, we can see that every day IIS is going to create a new log file, but you can change that to as frequently as every hour if you like, or as long as each month. I guess it really depends on how busy your FTP server is really. And now if you want to view these log files, we can simply click on View Logs in the Actions pane here, and this will open up Windows Explorer. And then we can select our FTP folder, and you're going to see your log files in here. Now our next icon here is FTP Messages, and the first option we have here is to suppress the default banner. And if we go back to our command prompt, the banner is this line 220 Microsoft FTP service. So if we go back to our console and we check this box to suppress the the default banner, when people FTP into our site, they'll only see this 220 value and they won't see that it's a Microsoft FTP service. So why would you want to disable this feature? Well, when attackers try to get into systems, one of the techniques they'll use, once they've identified that there is in fact an FTP server running, is to try and perform a technique called banner grabbing. So by grabbing this line, they'll identify that this is an FTP server that's running Microsoft's FTP service. So now that they know that it's a Microsoft FTP server, then all they need to do is look inside their bag of tricks or search Google for any known flaws or bugs or attacks specifically for the Microsoft FTP service. So by disabling the banner, it makes it just a little bit tougher for them to identify what version of FTP is running on the target machine. Now sure, it's not going to make your FTP server invulnerable to attack, but it will delay novice attackers since it's not immediately apparent what FTP server is running. Now next, we could also choose to support user variables in messengers. And if we hit F1 on our keyboard here, and let's just expand this help file here and we'll scroll down. This will show us what variables are supported. So we have bytes received, bytes sent, session ID, site name, and username. Now our other default here is to show detailed messages for local requests, which will simply display greater detail in any error messages when the FTP client is connecting to the FTP server on the server itself. Now next, in our message text section, we can set display messages that users will see when they access our FTP site. So this banner message is the text that the user will see when they enter in their username and password. So let's just enter something in here. We'll enter in Winstructor Lab FTP Site. The welcome message here is what the user is going to see once they're first authenticated. So let's type in hello friend. And our exit message, this will be displayed when the user terminates their session. So we'll just type in see you later. And finally, right down the bottom here, we can set some text to display when a user login's denied because there's already too many users logged on. So we could enter in something like bad luck. All right, so let's click apply and we'll save these changes. And if we go back to our command prompt here, we'll need to quit this session and let's just clear the screen. We'll log in again and we'll enter in the anonymous account and we'll hit enter. And the first couple of things you'll notice here is instead of saying a Microsoft FTP service, we're now saying the Winstructor Lab FTP site. We can see our login message of hello friend. And if we now go ahead and we quit this session, we'll get our exit message here of see you later. All right, well, let's go back to our console here and our training FTP site. Our next option is FTP SSL Settings, and this is where we can configure our site to use an SSL certificate. Now, the default SSL policy is whatever you set it up to be when you configured your site, which in my case was to allow SSL connections. But if you happen to set up your FTP site without changing any of the defaults, the real default would have been to require SSL connections for greater security. But if you do choose the custom option and then click advanced, you could choose to either allow or require SSL for both the control channel and the data channels as well. Alright, now our final option here is for FTP User Isolation. So before we start looking at how to configure this, what we'll do is we're going to delete our current FTP site. So we'll select that, we'll right click on it and we'll choose remove and we'll say yes. And we'll go ahead and we'll create a new one. But before we do that, we'll go to Windows Explorer and I'm going to go to my C drive and then our iNet pub folder. And in here, I'm going to right click and create a new folder, which I'll call FTP root. And then we'll go to our command prompt. And we're going to type in cackles %system drive %/inetpub/ftp root. And then we're going to use a /g switch followed by the iUser account :R and then the T and E switches. So what this command is going to do is it's going to grant read access to the iUser account on the access control list for our FTP root folder, and that's what this /G iUser :R part does. And then our /T switch is to change the access control list on this root directory and any subdirectories, and then the E is to edit the existing ACL and to not replace it. So if we run this command and then we go back to our Windows Explorer and right click on our FTP root folder and choose Properties, and then the Security tab, in here we should see the iUser account added with read access to this folder. Alright, well, in our FTP root folder we're going to create a couple of new folders as well, so we'll right click and we'll choose New Folder, and we're going to call this one Local User, and we're going to right click again, we'll create a new folder. I'm going to call this one Admin Files, and then we'll double click on our local user folder, and inside here I'm going to create a new folder which I'm going to call Public. Now inside our Public folder we'll right click, and like before we'll create a new bitmap image, and let's just call this one Public. That way we'll be able to identify that when we see this file we're actually inside our public folder when we log onto our FTP site anonymously. Alright, well now it's time to create our FTP site, so back to our IIS console we go, and we'll right click on Sites and we'll add an FTP site. We'll give it a name, we'll call it Isolated, but you can call it whatever you like of course, and for the path we'll go to our C drive, our inet pub folder, and we'll select the FTP root folder and we'll click on OK, then we'll select Next. I'm going to leave all of these defaults here as they are, although I will change to allow SSL, not require it, and we'll click Next again. Now we'll select Anonymous Authentication. In the drop down box here I'll choose All Users, and we'll set our permissions to read and click Finish. Alright, well, our FTP site has been created, so we'll select Isolated, our FTP site here on the left hand side of the console. And in the middle, we'll now go to this section here, FTP Authorization Rules. I did say we'd come back to that. And over on the right in our Actions pane here, we're going to add in an Allow rule. Now here, we'll be able to specify which users will be able to log into our site to take advantage of FTP isolation. So let's use the administrator account for this example. So I'm going to choose Specified Users, and we'll enter in Administrator. And we could enter in more accounts if we like by separating each one with a comma. We're going to grant our administrator read and write permissions, and we'll click on OK. Alright, now we'll double click on FTP User Isolations, and you can see we've got a few different configuration options here. The first two options aren't going to isolate users at all. They're simply going to start the users off in either our FTP root directory or a directory that defaults to the currently logged on username. But if one doesn't exist, then they'll just go to the default root directory anyway. Now we can also use isolation to restrict users to the same username directory as the account that they're logging on with, and this option here will disable any virtual directories that you might have created, and it does state that there. We could use isolation to restrict users to the same username's physical directory, and finally we can isolate each user to the home directory that's configured in their Active Directory user account. So let's choose the middle option here. We'll choose to isolate users to their username physical directory, and at the top here we'll click Apply. Now let's go to our command prompt and we'll FTP back into our site. We're going to enter in the username of Anonymous. And there we are, we're logged in, and if we now type in an ls, here we can see the public bitmap file that we created a moment ago. So we know that for anonymous users, we've forced them to go to our public directory. However, at this point, any real Windows users in our domain or on our server, they won't be able to log in yet. But let's try it anyway. Let's just quit this one, and we'll try an FTP back in, and we'll use the administrator account. And we'll hit enter, and we'll enter in the password for the administrator account. And you can see here that our home directory is not accessible. Now, the reason that this doesn't work is that when we want to isolate users, they need to have a home directory set up inside their user account. So let's go and launch the Server Management Console, and we'll expand Configuration, we'll expand Local Users and Groups, and we'll select Users. Now we'll right click on the administrator's account, and we'll choose Properties, and then the Profile tab. Now down here, under our Home folder heading, we'll need to enter in the local path to the FTP site. So that's going to be inetpub FTP root followed by local user, and then a folder with the same name of this user, which of course is administrator, and we'll click OK. Now let's go back to our command prompt and we'll try and log in again as the administrator, and we'll enter in the password there, and we're connected. So if we type in ls, you'll note here that this folder is blank. So let's go back to our Explorer window and we'll go back to our local user folder. Now you can see here that we have an administrator folder. So let's go into this folder here. Again, we'll right click, we'll create a new bitmap image, and we'll call this one admin. And we'll go back to our command prompt now and we'll type in an ls. And there we can see the new admin.bmp file. So we know that we're in the right directory. And now all we have to do is to configure the same settings for any other users that we want to be isolated, and they'll be able to FTP into their own folder and have their folder separated from the public folder, which is where all of the anonymous users are going to be sent. So as you can see, we've got a great deal of flexibility with isolating users in our FTP sessions if you're prepared to take those few moments to set it up. So in this video, we've discussed the configuration of FTP sites in IIS 7 in a lot of detail. Remember, if you want the new version of FTP, then you'll need to download it from Microsoft, since the old version of FTP that came with Windows 2003 is the one that you'll be installing if you install the version that comes with Windows 2008. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for supporting Winstructor.